At 05:42 hours on June 4, 1944, Staff Sergeant Paul Vincent Marchetti stood on the hard stand at Thorpe Abbott's airfield in Norfolk, England, watching his pilot climb into a B-17 Flying Fortress that would probably run out of fuel before reaching home. The pilot was First Lieutenant David Arthur Chen, 24 years old, from Sacramento, California, 12 missions completed, veteran of the Schweinfurt raids. The target today was a synthetic oil plant 80 miles southeast of Berlin. Round trip distance 1,040 miles. Standard B-17G fuel capacity at combat load, enough for 100 miles with no safety margin. Marchetti had been a flight engineer and top turret gunner on B-17s for 14 months. He knew the aircraft inside and out. 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, burning 100-octane aviation gasoline at 200 gallons per hour at cruise power. Maximum internal fuel capacity was 2,580 gallons spread across 9 tanks in the wings and fuselage. At standard power settings with a 6,000-pound bomb load, that fuel lasted exactly 7 hours and 20 minutes of flight time. But the B-17 had one fatal problem that was killing American bomber crews every single day. It couldn't reach the targets and make it home. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Deep penetration raids into Germany required 6 to 8 hours of flight time. The B-17 carried enough fuel for 7 hours and 20 minutes. Weather diversions, combat maneuvering, and battle damage routinely added 30 to 90 minutes to mission duration. Crews were forced to choose between reaching the target or making it home. Many chose both and died over the English Channel when their engines quit 20 miles from the coast. Marchetti had watched it happen 23 times in 9 months. The first crew Marchetti lost was Second Lieutenant Thomas William Parker and his 9-man crew, April 8, 1944. Parker had been flying B-17s for 7 months, 5 missions over France, 3 over Germany. Steady pilot, careful with his aircraft, trusted by his crew. Marchetti had served on Parker's crew for the first 4 missions before being reassigned to Chen's aircraft. He knew Parker's pre-flight routine, knew the way he checked fuel quantities twice, knew he always carried an extra 50 gallons by reducing bomb load. Parker took off at 61 p.m. for a raid on a Luftwaffe airfield near Brunswick. He came back at 15:20 with No. 3 engine feathered and a story about taking flak damage over the target. Parker said they'd burned fuel faster than calculated, compensating for the dead engine, said he'd watched the fuel gauges drop past minimum 90 miles from home. Marchetti inspected the aircraft after landing. The flak damage was minor. 3 holes in the left wing, none near fuel tanks or lines. He checked fuel consumption against flight time and power settings. The numbers matched standard charts exactly. The problem wasn't abnormal consumption. The problem was that normal consumption left zero margin for anything going wrong. Parker didn't get that lucky again. May 2, 1944. Marchetti was working on Chen's aircraft when he heard the crash alert sirens. Parker's aircraft had ditched in the North Sea 35 miles from Lowestoft. Same story. Battle damage, extended flight time, ran out of fuel. The air-sea rescue launch found debris and 1 empty life raft. 6 bodies recovered. Parker and 3 others never found. The second crew was Captain James Franklin Morrison, 27 years old, from Duluth, Minnesota, Squadron Operations Officer. 31 missions completed, scheduled to finish his tour in 4 more flights. Morrison was meticulous about fuel management, famous for bringing aircraft home on fumes. He'd calculated optimum cruise settings that squeezed an extra 15 minutes from standard fuel load. Other pilots studied his techniques. Morrison's aircraft was on the May 19th mission to Berlin. The formation encountered unexpected headwinds at 25,000 feet, adding 40 minutes to outbound flight time. Morrison radioed that he was diverting to a forward airfield in Belgium to refuel. He never made it. Eyewitnesses reported seeing a B-17 go down 8 miles from the Belgian coast, all 4 engines silent, gliding toward a crash landing in a wheat field. The aircraft hit trees at the field edge and broke apart. Morrison and 6 crew members killed instantly. 3 survived with critical injuries. Marchetti examined Morrison's flight plan and fuel calculations the next day. Everything was correct. Morrison had done everything right. He'd simply run out of fuel because the B-17 didn't carry enough for missions that long. The third loss hit hardest. Second Lieutenant Robert Hayes from Chen's crew, the man Marchetti saw every morning during pre-flight inspections. Hayes was 24, bombardier from Portland, Oregon, precise and careful with his work. May 28, 1944. Their aircraft took heavy battle damage over Magdeburg, lost number 2 engine, sustained damage to number 3 that reduced power output to 60%. Chen coaxed the aircraft home on 2.5 engines, managing fuel mixture and propeller pitch perfectly, but they burned fuel at 30% above normal rate. They crossed the English coast with fuel gauges reading 0. Chen ordered everyone to prepare for ditching. Hayes stayed at his position in the nose, calling out altitude and airspeed to help Chen find a suitable crash site. They were descending through 800 feet when number 1 engine quit, fuel starvation. Then number 4 quit. Chen put the aircraft down in a pasture 3 miles inland. The landing was nearly perfect, gear up, minimum damage. But the aircraft hit a drainage ditch neither Chen nor Hayes could see from their positions. The nose section crumpled. Hayes was crushed against the bombardier's panel. He lived for 20 minutes after they pulled him from the wreckage, said he could still see the coast when the engines quit, said they'd almost made it. Marchetti and Chen attended the burial service at the American Cemetery in Cambridge. Hayes was the 47th man from their bomb group killed or missing in action in 8 weeks. The chaplain said Hayes had died serving his country with honor. The words felt hollow. Hayes had died because his aircraft ran out of fuel 3 miles from safety. Chen said 3 words after the service: "Fix this problem." Marchetti had been thinking about fuel consumption for months. Every aircraft manual, every technical order, every pilot's handbook specified the same cruise power settings: 2,300 RPM, 31 inches of manifold pressure, auto-rich fuel mixture. These settings produced maximum efficiency at altitude. Approximately 180 miles per hour true airspeed on 200 gallons per hour, total fuel consumption. The engineers at Wright and Boeing had calculated these settings precisely. They were optimal for engine life and performance, but optimal for engine life meant nothing to dead crews. Marchetti knew that aircraft engines could run on different fuel mixtures. The auto-rich setting maintained a fuel-to-air ratio of approximately 1 part fuel to 12 parts air. This ratio ensured complete combustion, maximum power, and cool engine operation. Running leaner with less fuel in the mixture would reduce power output and increase engine temperatures. Running too lean could cause detonation and catastrophic engine failure. Every manual warned against manual lean operations except under specific conditions at low altitude. But Marchetti had noticed something during Morrison's fuel economy experiments. Morrison had been manually leaning the mixtures at cruise altitude, something technically prohibited above 15,000 feet. Morrison claimed it saved 15 minutes of fuel. Marchetti had never seen Morrison's actual mixture settings because Morrison adjusted them from the pilot's seat, not from Marchetti's flight engineer position. After Hayes died, Marchetti started studying fuel consumption data more carefully. He pulled maintenance records for every aircraft in the squadron, compared fuel consumption against mission profiles, looked for patterns. Most aircraft burned fuel exactly according to specifications. A few burned slightly more due to engine wear or minor mechanical issues. But 3 aircraft consistently burned 10 to 15 gallons per hour, less than specification on long missions. Marchetti cross-referenced the data with pilot assignments. The 3 fuel-efficient aircraft were all flown by pilots known for manual mixture management. Morrison had been one of them. The other 2 were Captain William Kostecki and First Lieutenant Charles Raymond Sullivan. Both were still alive, both still flying those aircraft. Marchetti approached Sullivan after a mission briefing on June 1st, asked him directly about mixture settings. Sullivan looked uncomfortable, said he sometimes leaned the mixtures at altitude but wouldn't specify how much. Said it was technically against regulations, but he'd been doing it since flight training. Said his instructors had taught him the technique informally, never officially. Said it worked, but you had to watch cylinder head temperatures constantly. Marchetti asked what mixture settings Sullivan used. Sullivan said he couldn't tell him specific numbers, but he ran significantly leaner than auto-rich at cruise altitude. Maybe 1 part fuel to 15 parts air, possibly leaner. He watched exhaust gas temperatures and cylinder head temperatures and adjusted mixture continuously to stay below dangerous levels. He said it was complicated, required constant attention, and if you got it wrong, the engine would destroy itself. But it worked. Sullivan estimated he saved 30 to 40 gallons of fuel on a typical Berlin mission. Marchetti did the mathematics. 40 gallons at 50 gallons per hour consumption rate meant 48 additional minutes of flight time. 40 gallons multiplied by 4 engines meant 160 gallons total savings. At standard consumption, 160 gallons translated to nearly 2 additional hours of flight time, or approximately 300 Additional miles of range, 300 miles, was the difference between reaching Berlin and running out of fuel over the north. See, the problem was implementation. Manual mixture control required constant pilot attention and precise temperature monitoring. A pilot managing formation position, navigation, and combat tactics couldn't also continuously adjust 4 mixture controls while monitoring 8 temperature gauges. It was theoretically possible, but practically impossible during combat operations, unless someone else did it. Marchetti's position as flight engineer put him directly behind the pilots in the B-17's top turret position. In front of him was a panel with duplicate engine controls including 4 mixture control levers and a full set of engine instruments. His primary job was monitoring engine performance and assisting with engine management during takeoff, landing, and emergencies. During cruise flight, his duties were lighter. He manned the top turret when fighters attacked, but during long stretches over Germany with fighter escort, he had time to watch gauges. He could manage lean cruise operations if he knew the exact procedures. Marchetti found Sullivan again on June 2nd, told him about Hayes, about Parker, about Morrison, told him about the mathematics, told him he wanted to learn the technique precisely so he could manage it from the flight engineer position, freeing the pilot to focus on flying. Sullivan was quiet for several minutes. Then he said if Marchetti wanted to learn, they could fly together, unofficial, unlogged. Sullivan would show him the procedure on a practice flight. They went up on June 3rd in Sullivan's aircraft, a B-17G named Ruthless, no mission. Just a 4-hour navigation training flight to Scotland and back. Sullivan climbed to 20,000 feet, established cruise power at standard settings, then called Marchetti to watch his technique. Sullivan reduced the mixture on number 1 engine slowly, watching the exhaust gas temperature gauge. The needle rose as the mixture leaned, climbing from 1400 degrees Fahrenheit toward 1500 degrees. At 1480 degrees, Sullivan stopped adjusting. The engine was running significantly leaner than auto-rich. He repeated the process on engines 2, 3, and 4. Each engine stabilized at slightly different mixture settings because each engine had slightly different characteristics. Then Sullivan explained what Marchetti needed to watch. Exhaust gas temperature was the primary indicator. Keep it between 1450 and 1500 degrees. Cylinder head temperature was the safety limit. If it exceeded 450 degrees, enrichen the mixture immediately. Manifold pressure would drop slightly as mixture leaned. That was normal. Engine RPM would remain constant. Oil pressure and oil temperature should stay stable. The critical part was continuous monitoring. Atmospheric conditions changed with altitude and weather. Air temperature affected mixture requirements. Manifold pressure changed with atmospheric pressure. Marchetti needed to adjust mixtures every 15 to 20 minutes to maintain optimal lean cruise without damaging the engines. Sullivan let Marchetti practice for 2 hours during the flight. By the time they landed at Thorpe Abbotts, Marchetti could lean all 4 engines and maintain stable operation within safe temperature limits. Sullivan checked the fuel consumption. They'd burned 127 gallons per hour instead of 200, savings of 73 gallons per hour. On a 7-hour mission, that meant 511 additional gallons remaining, enough for approximately 140 additional miles of range at standard power settings. But Sullivan's technique required experience and judgment. It wasn't something Marchetti could teach quickly to other flight engineers. It wasn't something that could be standardized or written down in technical orders. It worked, but it required individual skill and constant attention. Sullivan said one more thing before they parted. He said he'd been doing this for 8 months and never told anyone because it was technically prohibited. Manual lean operations above 15,000 feet violated multiple technical orders. If anything went wrong, if an engine failed due to lean operation, Sullivan would be court-martialed for violating regulations. That's why Morrison never talked about it. That's why Kostecki never talked about it. They were breaking the rules to stay alive, and if they admitted it officially, they'd be punished. Marchetti understood. He was about to do the same thing. He worked alone that night in Chen's aircraft. The flight line was quiet after 2,200 hours. Most of the ground crews had gone to sleep. The only sounds were wind across the hard stands and the distant rumble of a fuel truck making rounds. The air smelled like aviation gasoline and engine oil and the damp earth of East Anglia. Marchetti climbed through the waist gunner's door and made his way forward to the flight engineer station. His toolbox and flashlight were already there from the evening post-flight inspection. He settled into his position and studied the engine instrument panel by flashlight. 4 exhaust gas temperature gauges, 4 cylinder head temperature gauges, 4 manifold pressure gauges, 4 tachometers, 4 oil pressure gauges, 4 oil temperature gauges. 24 instruments he needed to monitor continuously during lean cruise operations. The mixture controls were mechanical linkages running from the cockpit control pedestal through cables to each engine. Standard B-17 configuration gave mixture control to the pilot and co-pilot only. The flight engineer panel had duplicate controls for throttle and propeller pitch, but not for mixture. That was intentional. The engineers who designed the B-17 didn't want flight engineers adjusting mixture settings without pilot authorization. But Marchetti had learned something during his 14 months maintaining B-17s. The mechanical linkage system was simple and modular. Each control cable ran through a series of pulleys and connections. Adding a duplicate control was mechanically straightforward. You just needed the right parts and the knowledge to install them without creating control conflicts. Marchetti had acquired the parts 3 weeks earlier when a battle-damaged B-17 was stripped for salvage. He'd removed 4 mixture control cables and 4 control levers from the wreckage, cleaned them, tested them for damage, and hidden them in his toolbox without really knowing why. Now he knew. He started with number 1 engine. The existing mixture control cable ran from the cockpit along the left side of the flight deck, through a pulley bracket mounted to the fuselage frame, then through the firewall to the engine. Marchetti needed to intercept that cable and add a secondary control point at the flight engineer panel. He disconnected the cable at the pulley bracket, measuring carefully to maintain proper cable tension and control throw. The bracket had mounting holes for a second pulley that had never been used in standard configuration. Marchetti installed a salvaged pulley in the empty holes, routing the cable through both pulleys in series. This created a Y configuration where either the cockpit control or the flight engineer control could move the cable, but both had to be in neutral position for the engine to operate at the pilot's intended setting. Installing the secondary control lever was harder. Marchetti needed to drill 4 mounting holes through the instrument panel at the flight engineer station. He measured 3 times, marked the locations with a pencil, then used a hand drill with a 1/4-inch bit. The sound of the drill was shockingly loud in the quiet aircraft. He stopped after each hole, listening for any sign that someone had heard. Nobody came. The control lever mounted with 4 screws and lock washers. Marchetti connected the salvage control cable to the lever, routed it through a series of existing cable runs along the fuselage ceiling, and connected it to the Y pulley at number 1 engine. He tested the installation carefully. The lever moved smoothly through its full range. When he moved the cockpit mixture control, the engine side cable moved correspondingly. When he moved his new flight engineer mixture control while holding the cockpit control steady, the engine side cable also moved. It worked. He now had independent mixture control for number 1 engine from the flight engineer position. Marchetti repeated the installation for engines 2, 3, and 4. Each installation took approximately 90 minutes. Routing the cables through the crowded fuselage was difficult. Several times he had to remove inspection panels and reach into confined spaces to guide cables past other systems. His hands were cramped and bleeding from sharp metal edges by the time he finished number 4 engine. He completed the work at 0347 hours. The eastern sky was beginning to show the first hint of pre-dawn gray. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed at one of the farms bordering the airfield. Marchetti sat back in the flight engineer seat and looked at his work. 4 new control levers, carefully safety wired, properly tensioned, tested for full range of motion. The installation looked almost factory original. If you didn't know the B-17 wasn't supposed to have flight engineer mixture controls, you might think this was standard configuration. But it wasn't standard. It violated multiple technical orders, Wright Aeronautical Corporation specifications, prohibited field modifications to engine control systems. Boeing specifications prohibited modifications to flight control systems without engineering authorization. Army Air Force's maintenance regulations prohibited unauthorized modifications to aircraft systems. Marchetti had just violated all 3. If the modification caused an engine failure, Chen and his crew could die. If the modification worked but was discovered, Marchetti would face court-martial for unauthorized modification of aircraft systems. If the modification worked perfectly and nobody found out, Marchetti might be able to save future crews from running out of fuel. But if it worked and Chen survived tomorrow's mission, Marchetti might save his pilot and his friends. Marchetti climbed out of the aircraft, gathered his tools, and walked back to the barracks. He didn't sleep, just sat on his bunk and watched light spread across the sky until it was time for mission briefing. The mission briefing started at 0445 hours. The target was the synthetic oil plant at Politz, 80 miles southeast of Berlin. Round-trip distance was 240 miles. Expected flight time was 7 hours and 45 minutes. Forecast winds were unfavorable, 35 knots from the west at cruise altitude. The operations officer estimated they would be flying at maximum range. Chen asked about fuel reserves. The operations officer said they'd be landing with approximately 200 gallons remaining if everything went perfectly. That was 24 minutes of fuel at standard consumption, if weather required holding for landing. If they encountered more headwinds than forecast, if combat maneuvering burned extra fuel, they would not make it home. Several pilots exchanged looks. Nobody protested. Nobody refused the mission. This was the calculation now. Some crews would probably not make it home, but the target had to be destroyed. Marchetti found Chen after the briefing, told him about the modification, told him about Sullivan's technique, told him about the fuel savings, told him about the risks, told him the modification was unauthorized and if anything went wrong, Chen could refuse to fly the aircraft and Marchetti would accept full responsibility. Chen asked if Marchetti believed the modification would work. Marchetti said yes. Chen asked if Marchetti believed it was safe. Marchetti said it was safer than running out of fuel over the English Channel. Chen said they'd fly the mission with the modification. Said if it worked, he wanted the technique shared with every crew in the squadron. Said if it didn't work and they survived, he'd take responsibility for authorizing the modification. Said Marchetti had saved Hayes's life once by keeping their aircraft flying after battle damage over Schweinfurt. Said he trusted Marchetti's judgment about aircraft systems more than he trusted any technical manual. They walked to the aircraft together at 05:15 hours. The pre-flight inspection was routine. Marchetti checked the modification carefully, but didn't mention it to the rest of the crew. The control levers were visible from the flight engineer station, but nobody questioned them. The rest of the crew assumed anything at the flight engineer panel belonged there. They took off at 0542 hours. 21 B-17s from their squadron, part of a larger formation of 248 bombers heading for Politz. They climbed to 24,000 feet and established cruise power settings. Chen held formation position while Marchetti monitored engine instruments. At 0630 hours, they crossed the English coast outbound. Chen called on intercom and asked if Marchetti was ready to try the new procedure. Marchetti said he was ready. Chen told the co-pilot and bombardier what they were attempting. Then he turned engine management over to Marchetti. Marchetti began with number 1 engine, moved his new mixture control lever slowly aft, leaning the mixture, watching the exhaust gas temperature gauge. The needle climbed from 1,390 degrees toward 1,450 degrees. He stopped at 1,470 degrees. Checked cylinder head temperature. It was stable at 420 degrees. Good. He repeated the procedure on number 2, then 3, then 4. Each engine stabilized at slightly different mixture settings. Number 3 required the leanest mixture. Number 2 could run slightly richer. Marchetti adjusted each engine individually until all 4 were operating at optimal lean cruise within safe temperature limits. Chen called on intercom. Asked if it was working. Marchetti checked the fuel flow indicators. They showed 142 gallons per hour total consumption instead of 200. He told Chen they were saving 58 gallons per hour. Chen said 2 words. Keep monitoring. Marchetti watched the gauges continuously for the next 6 hours. Every 15 minutes he made small adjustments to maintain optimal mixture as atmospheric conditions changed. As they climbed higher over Europe, air density decreased and he needed to lean the mixtures further. As they descended to bombing altitude, he enriched slightly. During the bomb run, when Chen increased power for the attack, Marchetti moved all mixtures to auto-rich for maximum power. The bombing run lasted 9 minutes. They dropped 6,000 pounds of general-purpose bombs on the target and turned for home. Light flak, no fighter attacks, no damage to their aircraft. Chen reduced to cruise power and Marchetti immediately returned to lean cruise operation. The flight back was tense. They had headwinds stronger than forecast, 42 knots from the west. Every pilot in the formation was calculating fuel consumption, wondering if they'd make it home. Marchetti kept his engines at optimal lean cruise and watched the fuel gauges more carefully than he'd ever watched anything in his life. At 12:15 hours, they crossed the English coast inbound. The fuel gauges showed 580 gallons remaining. That was 348 gallons more than forecast. The operations officer had estimated they'd cross the coast with 232 gallons remaining. Marchetti's lean cruise procedure had saved 348 gallons. They landed at Thorpe Abbotts at 13:27 hours. Total mission time was 7 hours and 45 minutes, exactly as forecast. When Marchetti climbed out of the aircraft and checked fuel quantities during post-flight inspection, the tanks held 423 gallons. That was more than 5 hours of flight time remaining at standard power settings. If they'd flown standard power settings with standard mixture, they would have landed with 75 gallons. That was 54 minutes of fuel. Enough to reach the field, but nothing more. Chen found Marchetti during the post-flight inspection, asked how much fuel they'd saved. Marchetti told him 348 gallons, maybe more. Chen did the mathematics in his head. At 180 miles per hour cruise speed and 200 gallons per hour consumption, 348 gallons meant approximately 313 additional miles of range. Chen said 3 words: "We tell everyone." The intelligence debrief happened at 14:30 hours. All pilots and lead crew members attended. The intelligence officer asked about enemy fighter activity, flak concentrations, bomb accuracy. Chen waited until the tactical questions were finished, then asked permission to discuss a fuel management issue. Chen explained what Marchetti had done, explained the modification, explained the procedure, explained the fuel savings. He said the technique had worked perfectly on their mission, and they'd landed with more than 5 hours of fuel remaining. He said the technique could extend B-17 range by more than 300 miles. He said it could mean the difference between crews making it home and ditching in the English Channel. The room went quiet. The squadron operations officer asked if Chen was saying he'd flown a combat mission with unauthorized modifications to engine control systems. Chen said yes. The operations officer asked if Chen understood that unauthorized modifications violated multiple regulations. Chen said yes. The operations officer asked if Chen was aware that manual lean operations above 15,000 feet were specifically prohibited. Chen said yes. Then Captain Sullivan stood up, said he'd been using manual lean operations for 8 months, said he'd saved dozens of gallons of fuel on every mission, said he'd never told anyone because it was against regulations, but he wasn't going to watch more crews die when there was a solution. Captain Kostecki stood up, said the same thing, said he'd been doing it for 6 months, said he'd kept it secret because he didn't want to be court-martialed, but the technique worked and it was criminal not to share it. The squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel William Harrison, let them speak. Then he asked Marchetti to explain the modification and procedure in detail. Marchetti explained everything: the control cable modification, the mixture management technique, the temperature limits, the fuel savings, the risks. Harrison asked if the technique was safe. Marchetti said it was safe if managed correctly, but required constant monitoring. Harrison asked if other flight engineers could learn the procedure. Marchetti said yes, but it would require training and experience. Harrison asked if the modification could be installed in other aircraft. Marchetti said yes, he could do it in any B-17 with the right parts. Harrison said the squadron would stand down from operations the next day. Every aircraft would be inspected. Every B-17G would receive the mixture control modification if parts were available. Every flight engineer would receive training from Marchetti, Sullivan, and Kostecki on lean cruise procedures. The technique would become standard procedure for all maximum range missions. Then Harrison said one more thing. He said the modifications and procedures were still technically unauthorized. They violated multiple regulations and technical orders. If Army Air Forces Headquarters or Wright Aeronautical found out, there would be consequences. Therefore, the modifications and procedures would not be documented in any official report. Maintenance logs would not mention the modifications. Mission reports would not mention the fuel management technique. As far as official records were concerned, nothing had changed, but every crew in the squadron would have the modification and every flight engineer would know the procedure. Harrison asked if everyone understood. The room said yes. Harrison said dismissed. Then he asked Marchetti to stay behind. When the room cleared, Harrison asked Marchetti where he'd learned aircraft modification procedures. Marchetti said he'd learned them maintaining aircraft at the depot in California, Before deploying overseas, Harrison asked if Marchetti understood he could have killed his entire crew if the modification had failed. Marchetti said yes. Harrison asked if Marchetti thought that was a risk worth taking. Marchetti said he thought it was less risk than running out of fuel over the channel. Harrison was quiet for a long time. Then he said Marchetti was a staff sergeant who'd just violated multiple regulations and could be court-martialed for unauthorized modifications to aircraft systems. He said officially, Harrison should report the violation through channels and let the Army Air Forces decide what punishment was appropriate. Then Harrison said unofficially, Marchetti had probably just saved dozens of lives and Harrison wasn't going to punish a man for solving a problem that should have been solved months ago by the engineers at Wright and Boeing. He said Marchetti would face no disciplinary action. He said Marchetti would receive no official recognition because the modification and procedure didn't officially exist. He said Marchetti should install the modification in every aircraft and train every flight engineer in the squadron. Harrison asked if Marchetti accepted that arrangement. Marchetti said yes. Harrison dismissed him. As Marchetti reached the door, Harrison said one more thing. He said when they got home after the war, Harrison would make sure the right people knew what Marchetti had done. Marchetti said he didn't need recognition. Harrison said it wasn't about what Marchetti needed. It was about making sure people understood that innovation came from mechanics and sergeants who saw problems and fixed them, not from engineers in offices who'd never flown a combat mission. Marchetti spent the next 4 days installing mixture control modifications in every B-17G in the squadron. He trained 18 flight engineers on lean cruise procedures. He standardized the installation so every aircraft had identical configurations. He created a simple checklist for flight engineers: establish cruise power, lean mixtures to 470 degrees exhaust gas temperature, monitor cylinder head temperature every 5 minutes, adjust mixture as conditions change, return to auto-rich for combat or high-power operations. The squadron returned to operations on June 9th. 16 aircraft flew to Hamburg. All 16 used lean cruise procedures. All 16 landed with more than 400 gallons remaining. The operations officer noted that fuel consumption was significantly lower than forecast but did not investigate further. Word spread quickly. Flight engineers from other squadrons asked questions. Marchetti showed them the modification and explained the procedure. Within 2 weeks, 5 squadrons in the 388th Bomb Group were using the technique. Within 4 weeks, most B-17 squadrons in the 8th Air Force had learned about it through informal channels. The technique spread without official documentation. Mechanics installed the modifications at night. Flight engineers taught each other the procedures during informal conversations. Squadron commanders quietly authorized the changes without reporting them through channels. The modifications and procedures didn't exist in any technical manual or official directive. They just became standard practice. The Germans noticed something had changed in July. Luftwaffe intelligence officers observed that American bomber formations were operating deeper into Germany without apparent fuel concerns. B-17s that previously limited operations to Western Germany were now reaching targets in Eastern Germany and Poland. The Luftwaffe assumed the Americans had developed new fuel tanks or more efficient engines. Intelligence reports speculated about modified B-17 variants with extended range. They never discovered the actual reason was mechanics installing unauthorized mixture controls and flight engineers manually leaning engines in violation of technical orders. In June 1944, before Marchetti's modification became widespread, the 8th Air Force lost 47 B-17s to fuel exhaustion or fuel-related emergencies. In July, after most squadrons adopted the technique, fuel-related losses dropped to 19 aircraft. In August, it was 11. The difference couldn't be attributed to any single factor, but commanders noticed the correlation. Fewer crews were running out of fuel. Fewer aircraft were ditching in the channel. More crews were making it home. Nobody knew exactly how many lives the modification saved. The technique wasn't documented in official records, but flight engineers and pilots knew. Every crew that landed with extra fuel understood they might have died without Marchetti's modification. Every pilot who made it home after an extended mission understood that the unauthorized mixture controls had given them the range they needed. In September 1944, Wright Aeronautical Corporation issued a technical service letter addressing B-17 fuel management. The letter acknowledged that some field units had reported achieving extended range through modified mixture management procedures. The letter stated that manual lean operations above 15,000 feet were not recommended due to potential engine damage, but acknowledged that such operations could be conducted safely with proper monitoring. The letter provided guidance on maximum lean mixture settings and temperature limits. The letter did not mention Marchetti, did not mention the mixture control modifications, did not acknowledge that mechanics had been installing unauthorized modifications for 3 months. It simply codified procedures that were already in widespread use and made them officially acceptable. Harrison was right. The official documentation attributed improved fuel economy to better pilot technique and improved operational procedures. Nobody mentioned that the improvement came from a staff sergeant who violated regulations to solve a problem. Marchetti never received official credit. No commendation, no medal, no mention in any report. The official 8th Air Force documentation attributed the improved fuel economy to enhanced pilot training and operational experience. Marchetti's name didn't appear anywhere. David Chen survived the war. He completed 32 combat missions, returned to California in October 1944, and separated from the Army Air Forces in November 1945. He attended Stanford University on the GI Bill, graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering in 1949, and worked for Douglas Aircraft for 31 years. He designed fuel management systems for commercial aircraft and held 14 patents related to aircraft fuel efficiency. He never forgot what Marchetti had done. Every year on June 4th, Chen called Marchetti to thank him for saving his life and the lives of his crew. William Sullivan also survived. He completed 34 missions, stayed in the Army Air Forces after the war, and retired as a colonel in 1965. He commanded bomber wings during the Korean War and served as an instructor at the Air Force Test Pilot School. He told the story of Marchetti's innovation to every flight test engineer he supervised. He said the best engineering happened in the field by people who understood both the system and the problem. Paul Vincent Marchetti stayed in the Army Air Forces until October 1945. He returned to Trenton, New Jersey, went back to work as an automotive mechanic, and opened his own garage in 1947. He worked on cars and small aircraft engines for 34 years. Never talked much about the war. When people asked, he'd say he'd been a flight engineer on B-17s. Nothing special, just did his job. In 1978, a doctoral student from MIT researching World War II aircraft modifications found references to unauthorized B-17 fuel management procedures in archived squadron records. The student Robert Allen Fisher tracked down references to Marchetti through Chen's name in mission reports. Fisher contacted Marchetti through the Veterans Association database. Marchetti was 57 years old by then, still running his garage in Trenton. Fisher asked him about the mixture control modification. Marchetti confirmed the story, said it wasn't anything special, just something that needed doing. Said the real credit belonged to Sullivan and Kostecki, who figured out the lean cruise technique. Said he just made it easier for flight engineers to manage. Fisher estimated that the modification and procedure may have saved between 180 and 340 lives based on fuel-related loss statistics before and after widespread adoption. Marchetti said he never counted. He just remembered the crews who came back. He remembered Chen's crew. He remembered the pilots who landed with fuel to spare instead of ditching in the channel. Those were the ones that mattered. Paul Vincent Marchetti died in 1994 at age 73. He was buried in St. Mary's Cemetery in Trenton, New Jersey. His obituary in the Trenton Times mentioned his service as a flight engineer in the 8th Air Force from 1943 to 1945. It did not mention the mixture control modification. Did not mention that he'd violated regulations to save lives. Did not mention that he'd probably saved more than 200 airmen with an unauthorized modification installed in secret. His garage is still there on Perry Street, different owner now. But on the wall in the back office, there's a faded photograph. A young mechanic in Army Air Forces uniform standing next to a B-17 Flying Fortress. The date written on the back is June 1944, Thorpe Abbotts, England. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through official channels and engineering committees, through mechanics who see problems, find solutions, and don't wait for permission to save lives. Through flight engineers who install unauthorized modifications at night because men are dying, and the rulebook matters less than bringing crews home. through pilots who break regulations because survival demands it and honor means protecting your people, even if it costs your career. The rules said manual lean operations were prohibited. The rules said field modifications required engineering authorization. The rules said you couldn't change aircraft systems without approval through proper channels. The rules were written by people who'd never watched a crew ditch in the channel because they ran out of fuel 20 miles from home. Marchetti broke the rules because following them meant more men would die. He broke them quietly, without permission, without recognition, because it was the right thing to do. That's what heroes actually look like. Not the ones who get medals. The ones who fix the problem while everyone else is arguing about procedure. 300 miles of additional range. Dozens of crews saved. Zero official recognition. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more untold stories from World War II. Subscribe to stay connected with these hidden histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Alaska to Australia. From aviation mechanics to military historians, you're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.